Hello, everyone. I'm here with Austin Okigbo, Associate Professor of Ethnomusicology at the University of Colorado at Boulder. He holds a PhD in Ethnomusicology and African Studies from Indiana University, master's degrees in sacred music and music education from Westminster Choir College, and degrees in philosophy and theology from Pontifical Urban University in Rome. Professor Okigbo's research focuses on, among other things, music and pandemics. He was recently featured in an article in CU Boulder Today, which is the university's internal newspaper, on music and pandemics of 2020. I've linked the article in the description. So, Professor, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're welcome.
If I were to just say, music and pandemics or music and disease, those things don't really seem all that related at first glance. How or why could someone make a study of those things together? What might you say?
Yeah, they don't immediately sound like they are related, isn't it? Because one, we tend to imagine from the perspective of aesthetics, entertainment. The other has to do with human health, which we tend to also more commonly imagine through the perspective of physiology. And so we don't often see the connection. However, there is an increasing understanding that healthcare is not just a medical process, a medical condition or physiological condition. Rather, health is also culturally imagined. And because it is a cultural phenomenon, that's at the point that constitutes the point of intersection, because of the fact that music is a form of cultural expression or expressive culture. So why is health considered a cultural phenomenon? Because people have cultural ways of thinking and imagining health and diseases. And oftentimes, when you look at the history of global health, we tend to find more preponderance of record keeping in the medical field, which kind of tend to explain to us like maybe the vectors for transmission of disease, symptoms of disease, inventions of cure, and preventive measures. But those don't tell us anything about these cultural imaginations, which, by the way, account for the various ways in which people tend to respond to their experiences of diseases and epidemics. And the only space or only context or forms in which you find articulations of those experiences and imaginations are in people's expressive forms, including most especially music.
Wow, that's quite a lot. That's remarkable. Wow, I'm almost unsure of where exactly I want to pick up with that. So would you say music can act as a kind of archive of how people have actually responded to disease and pandemics, like over time?
Yes, both archive as well as in the moment, because archival, when it becomes historical, right? Because then we can go back in order to figure out, that becomes the archival resource for understanding how people thought about and responded to disease epidemics. But it's also, when it has not become historical, we can still monitor it in the moment, like we are doing currently with the current pandemic, global pandemic, and looking at patterns that are there that are showing up in expressive forms already across the cultural spectrum. Yeah.
So picking up on that point, in your CU Boulder Today interview article, you mentioned, and you've already mentioned also, sort of biological or physiological ways of understanding disease. also cultural ways of understanding disease. Have you noticed any patterns or like particular patterns in how these ways of understanding converge or diverge in pandemics?
Oh yeah, because the thing is that those cultural ways of understanding or imagining diseases have impact or impinge upon how people respond to given disease epidemics, like our current situation, right? So think about it. So sometimes those cultural factors can either exacerbate the spread of the disease, mitigating its containment, or may actually lead to helping to contain it. So let me use a more common general example. For instance, you talk about democracy, right? So the American exceptionalism, as articulated by Tocqueville, is its democratic model, right?
Right.
Which is actually built on the principle of philosophy of individualism and civil liberty, where individuals think that they are free to do what nobody should mandate me to do anything. The implication is America has fallen behind the rest of the world, especially much of the industrial world, by virtue of beginning from the leadership at the top to many of the libertarian people who tend to exude this libertarian propensity to continue to flout the guidelines that have been provided by experts in the global and public health sector. The implication is we have not been able to contain it. But it has implication not only for the United States, but for the global health in general, because America occupies a very important place in the circus of global health, right? So the failure in the United States has a very serious impact on the rest of the globe, whether it is as far as the pandemic itself is concerned, or even the global economics.
Yeah. Wow. So a lot of your field work sort of before this current pandemic, if I recall correctly, took place in South Africa and focused on the HIV/AIDS pandemic. What say consonances or dissonances have you discovered or uncovered between the current pandemic and that pandemic in particular as a sort of point of comparison?
Well, first of all, yeah, South Africa is my field of research, and primarily on HIV/AIDS. But one of the things I did in my study in South Africa is to dig beyond the HIV/AIDS. And in the process, I wanted to see if there are antecedent musical responses to epidemics. And the implication is I had to look at and identify documentations of disease epidemics from the time they started keeping records in South Africa. So hence I was able to go back to 1713 with the first recorded case of smallpox in South Africa, and then going through looking at others, typhoid, malaria, all the way to the influenza of 1918, and of course the HIV/AIDS coming. And one of the things in the process, I also have to look at what are some of the cultural indicators. And it's by searching for cultural indicators that I discovered musical responses, at least in 2 instances, smallpox and influenza. Then I had to start juxtaposing them with that of HIV/AIDS. That's when I started seeing the common patterns that led me to theorize, to bring forth the theory. I proposed that when social conditions, social, cultural, and political conditions persist, even if separated over time by centuries, And then what I call the social, cultural, and political conditions is what Marina Roseman has identified as the parabolas of public health, or if you like, the non-finites when it comes to public health, right? What are some of these non-finites? Kinship, faith, religion, economics, politics. They are some of the non-finites. Why are they called parabolas or non-finites? Because they are things that remain, that will continue to be modifiers as far as public health is concerned. And so my theory then is that when these conditions persist in a given society, regardless of time difference, they are bound to continue. So the similarities of the conditions of some of these parabolas or non-finites persisting over time means that every emergent disease of epidemiological magnitude they are bound to evoke the similar types of response. And that's why, and given the fact that these responses, social, cultural driven responses to epidemics tend to find expression more in music. That's how I came up to the idea that studying music of past pandemics or epidemics can predict current or future ways of human behaviors.
Yeah. So there's a phenomenon whereby these cultural constants, parabolas of the non-finite, I think was the term. That's
parabolas or non-finites.
Or non-finite. Okay, parabolas or non-finites. That's such an interesting concept. If these things are constant, they tend to override the influence of our given medical technology. It seems that if those things are constant, then our response to disease will be constant over time.
So the human behaviors will remain the same.
Yeah. Wow.
And therefore, as talking about social epidemiology, then my recommendation is that we must therefore factor this in our approach to containing any form of disease epidemic.
Yeah. Have you found, and this is maybe slightly to left turn, have you found any like biblical or religious parallels that seem salient in your research? I mean, obviously there's like the plagues of Egypt or whatever. I'm wondering if you've, since you have some background in theology, I'm just wondering if you found any particularly relevant parallels.
Well, yeah, beyond the biblical examples that we find in the book of Exodus, there was one of the boys which could have been an early documented form of the bubonic plague, right? And then some other of the plagues. Europe, for instance, has more documentations of plagues going back to the 14th century at least. And there have been earlier plagues in Greece, in Mesopotamia, that are documented, but nobody really knew exactly what they were like. But from the 14th century, especially in Europe, in Western Europe, you begin to have documentations of bubonic plague, different outbreaks of plagues. It was constant. Sometimes in 2-3 years, you have different outbreak of plagues of different sorts, going all the way into the 16th, 17th century. And those evoked religious responses and musical responses by extension. An example would be the plague of the 16th century in Rome and Milan that evoked the 15th century, but then in the 16th century, some compositions of songs like Motet, which was in honor of Mary, called Stella Celi Ex Depavit, which is a plain chant, but later on was set into a motet style by Boccaccio, the Italian composer. But then if you look at the song, it's an attribute to Mary. It's a song in honor of the Blessed Virgin Mary, who is given the title of a star. She has so many star titles, right? Morning Star, Star of the Sea. It's it's not as simple as just giving her a title because she's beautiful.
Right.
That title also has cosmological roots, because the cosmological understanding at the time, the worldview understanding at the time, is that the movement of the luminaries, the heavenly bodies, the stars, have the ability to disrupt the dynamics of activities on the universe, including disrupting to the extent of causing epidemics and plagues. So the stars are saying this is theoretically what you call sympathetic resonance, right? So the stars, when they are warring, they cause affliction in human society. And therefore, there is one person who is another star that possesses the power and the ability to stop the stars from warring in order to, so her intervention, so the song is a prayer to her to intervene as a star that possesses more power to prevent the warring of the stars in order to eliminate the affliction that they are imposing on people.
What is the name of that? It's a 15th century motet?
Yeah, it's still called Stella Celli Extirpavit.
Stella Celli. I'll look it up.
Extirpavit, yeah.
I'll put it in the description. That's fantastic. Going along with the musical metaphors for disease, you use the term in your CU Boulder Today article, epidemiological noise. I love the concept of noise as it relates to knowledge and musicology. So can you expand on the idea of epidemiological noise?
I call it epidemiological noise because I see the noise that is drowning out good sense of medical care and management of the pandemic as epidemic itself. Because it has become in and of itself a different type of epidemic. It has become a disease. So I call it epidemiological noise for that very reason. But epidemiological noise because also it is closely tied to our current experiences of the current pandemic. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the idea of misinformation or lack of guidance.
And exactly. So there are multiple aspects of that epidemiological noise. There is the issue of the misinformation, the bickering that is going on. So there's so much. The implication is, all the conspiracy theories, when all of these things converge, then it becomes a noise of a sort that interferes with processing interferes with the right information and the ability of citizens to process that right information in order to react the appropriate way, respond accordingly, in a manner that will help the containment of the disease. So then there is confusion all over, to the extent that there is distrust across the board. You think about it, for instance, when somebody says, if the scientists say that this vaccine is what we need, I'll be the first to be on the line to take it. But if the president recommends it, I'm not going to take it. So you're already looking at, the interference because of the noise and the pandemonium that is there.
So you could almost, if you run with this idea, you could almost even say that the pandemic started before COVID hit.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. So talking about these non-finites, right? When I talk about persistence in social, cultural, economic, and political conditions, when those conditions persist, it doesn't matter the type of epidemic that emerges. People's response are going to be similar. So then if you say, you can as well argue that the pandemic started before it even happened, because we're already a divided society.
I just want to write that down. The pandemic started before it even happened.
Yeah.
That's remarkable. Shifting a bit to slightly more theoretical topic. So ethnomusicologists borrow a lot from anthropology, and especially the idea of the field as a place of study. In your earlier work, the field was basically South Africa. But of course, the field is not necessarily a physical place. It can also be a virtual space or a temporal space, if that makes any sense. It's kind of a way of seeing, or I think Harris Berger defines it as a way of seeing the world and making sense of social phenomena.
Mm-hmm.
In regard to the current pandemic or pandemics that we've identified, what is the field as you understand it?
Well, the field has become more of, it has become amorphous, if you like. I'm no longer necessarily just looking at South Africa. South Africa, my initial research, and the article that came out of that research that was published in the Journal of Folklore Research, which has received a lot of more visibility more recently because of the COVID pandemic, was titled South African Music in the History of Epidemics, where I looked at these historical moments from 1713 through the present time with HIV/AIDS. So that was a field for me, a physical field, a historical field as well also, that allowed me to then come up to project a theory that is now, that you can now look at that theory and you can see the relevance, the validity of the theory, because what I projected when I said, when social, cultural, political conditions persist, human behaviors and responses to epidemics will remain similar. So you see what you call a kind of constance. So, and drawing from there, especially in light of current pandemics, I'm no longer just looking at South Africa. And now I'm now looking at multiple instances. And in fact, even before this, I was already doing research. I've been doing research still at the preliminary stage, but a while now for the past 2 years, looking at consumption disease with Jewish communities Jewish immigrants that came from Eastern Europe and settled in Denver area, the metro area. Because the Jewish, what you call the Jewish national health actually started here in Denver, not in New York, as people think. And the Jewish immigrants, many of them come from Eastern Europe. They were being carried from the trains. Many of them had tuberculosis, which was called then the consumption disease. If you look at some of the old architectures around Denver, it's the experience of that disease that actually informed it, because of the belief that airing people on the sun that did help to mitigate and reduce the symptoms of tuberculosis. So the architecture provided for that kind of therapy, emergent therapy. And so again, you're looking at cultural expression here and how it relates to disease conditions.
Wow, that's also remarkable. My next question was going to be, how can you appeal to the previous field as an archive for your own current work? But I think you just kind of answered that. So, oh gosh, now I'm looking at the remaining questions and I'm thinking that a lot of them are kind of things that we've already covered. So we'll go with this one. If the field is kind of a way of seeing, and you're talking about epidemiological noise,
yeah,
of like ways of seeing and ways of hearing or ways of listening. Mm-hmm. I just ruined my phrasing of this question. What do you think it says about ways of seeing or ways of hearing that are problematic or helpful, or what it says or reflects about our current predicament? You may have already kind of answered this.
Yeah, I guess I've already touched on that, but again, clearly, it tells us, it explains for us why some of the things that some of us consider anomalies in social situation of this country. Take for instance, when at the first instance of the lockdown, we saw people carrying guns, armed, and storming state houses and Capitol buildings, like in Michigan. Even here in Denver, it happened. And then, like in the interview that I had with the CEO today, which didn't necessarily come out, appear in that article, one of the questions I said I asked myself is, when people arm themselves with AR-15 and they storm state houses and Capitol buildings and parade around and decide to defy the lockdown order and all of that, my question is, are they carrying this gun to shoot the public policymakers or to shoot the virus? So what is the gun for? If you're gonna protest, you don't want somebody telling you what to do. Do you need a gun for that? Because what is the gun gonna do for you? Are you gonna shoot the virus? Are you gonna shoot the governor or the attorney general or the epidemiologist who is advising them? So what is the problem? Then people weave in this idea of patriotism, freedom. And I said to them, okay, why is this thing called public health? Yes, we all recognize the individual rights and freedom to do what you want. But remember that freedom to do what you want that freedom ends where my own right begins. And when it comes to the reason why this thing is called public health situation is because it's not your personal health alone. Mm-hmm. It's your health and my health and the health of everybody else. And the best form of patriotism you can show is to participate, join with your fellow citizens in fighting this virus and doing whatever experts recommend that we need to do to contain it in order to eliminate it. Because if we're going to just live solely on the idea of our individual rights and freedom, then we're never going to be able to contain it. And the longer it lingers, this whole concern about the economics and its impact on the economy will continue to linger anyway. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Well, that basically that hits it, doesn't it? I think that's probably pretty much everything I have. Is there any final comment or topic or anything you would like to touch on before we wrap up?
Well, as an ethnomusicologist, my advice to both students, scholars in the field, is to continue to be attentive to some of the things that have been recommended by people veterans who have come before us. Actually, what inspired me to start looking at the historical aspects of my, allowing history, the historical excavations or archival studies to inform what I do, is the recommendation of people like Alan Merriam and Tim Rice, who called for historical studies as a means of reconstructing history. So what I did in my study in South Africa is that I drew from there in order to reconstruct history. But it's not only to reconstruct history. By reconstructing history, it allowed me to then posit theory and hypothesis and theory that can allow us to project further, so that we don't see what we do as ethnomusicologists as just simply analyzing what is happening now. As a matter of fact, understanding what happened before and allowing what happened before to shed light on what is happening now allows us also to engage in some kind of scientific approach, because science does not just solve immediate problems. Scientific studies allows you also to anticipate what is to come next. So when I published this in my book in 2016 and then an article following that came out later on in 2017, not many people thought what I was saying made any sense, but now it's beginning to make sense because we're beginning to see that. Just the other day, I got a note from Professor Beckerman at NYU, who used the same reading, the same literature in his class at New York University. And today I'm actually going to be lecturing at Florida State University in Michael Bachan's class on the same topic. It's just more and more people are beginning to see, oh, there is actually value in this approach to ethnomusicological studies, so that in everything that we do, we shouldn't limit ourselves. This is my position, this is my opinion. We must not just be limiting ourselves to what is happening now, but see yourself as ethnomusicologist as somebody who stands at the juncture of history that allows the past, the present, and the future to converge. And that's the level at which the scientificity of your work is meaningful and operational.
Very good. Well, that is certainly a lot to think about, and I think that's all like fantastic, and I'm delighted by how this went. So thank you very much for your time, Professor. Again, Austin Okigbo teaches ethnomusicology at the University of Colorado at Boulder. There are some resources in the description below. Thank you for your time, Professor.
You're welcome, and have a nice one. Thank you.
Stay healthy.
Yeah.